Hello, everyone. My name is John Lieske, and I'll be talking about Ansible with you today. Real quick before we get started, wanted to let you know that this will be recorded and will be shared with you after we're done. So you will be getting a recorded copy of this in your email. Today, we're going to be going over the basics of Ansible Automation Platform, after which we'll have a short Q&A where I'll try to answer what I can. With me providing some answers will be my teammate Anshul Bell. And let's get started. All right, so let's talk about Red Hat Ansible Automation Platform. What is it? The Ansible project is the open source community project that's sponsored by Red Hat. Ansible Engine is the supported product built from the Ansible project. Ansible Tower is the framework for utilizing Ansible Engine within your company. There's an open source version of Tower called the AWX project, and that's associated with the Ansible GitHub. So what's so great about Ansible? To start with, Ansible is simple. It doesn't need your teams to all be at the same experience level. As such, Ansible makes it really easy to get started. Playbooks are written in YAML, which is easy to read for us humans, and playbooks tend to work consistently across many environments. The second reason is Ansible is powerful in how many nodes it can spin up and manage at once and at scale. Ansible is able to do this easily due to the fact that Ansible is agentless. No agents to keep up to date means the requirements are pretty minimal. Being agentless isn't just a Red Hat or Linux exclusive. It applies to Windows machines, networking devices, physical and cloud systems, and most of your static or dynamic inventory. Excuse me, I'm sorry. One of the selling points of Ansible is that it works great with your existing tools. If you're looking for somewhere to start with Ansible, pick a pain point in your environment. Focus on using Ansible to address that problem. Get acquainted with Ansible, and then you can expand it across your environment over time. Once Ansible is installed, you'll need to get acquainted with how it works. This slide shows the relationship between the main components of Ansible automation, starting with you, the person writing or using the Ansible playbook. We'll go into detail about the other components. Like I mentioned, playbooks are written in YAML. Playbook tasks invoke Ansible modules, which get executed sequentially from top to bottom in your playbook. Modules are executable bits of code, often Python, that get pushed out to the hosts. Using Ansible means you don't need to understand the underlying code to get it to do the work. You, the user, just need to be able to pass the arguments in the playbooks. Luckily, the documentation on modules allows you to look them up and make sure you're using all the correct syntax. Plugins are also pieces of code that add to Ansible's core functionality. Ansible uses a plugin architecture to give you flexibility for your automation. It comes out of the box with a few useful plugins, and you can easily write your own. Modules within tasks act against your inventory, which consists of hosts and groups. In this example slide, there are 2 hosts from the web group and 1 host in the DB group listed by fully qualified domain name. They can also be listed by IP address or host names that are alias to an IP address. They basically need to be network accessible. Ansible Automation can dynamically pull your inventory from existing cloud infrastructure and act against cloud APIs. If you're deleting an AWS VPC or provisioning a VM on Microsoft Azure, Ansible can do those things for you. So where is the inventory coming from? Well, it doesn't really matter, as Ansible plays nice with everything. The thing that matters is that Ansible has hosts to manage. If you have that, Ansible can push out playbooks that use modules that act against those inventory. Then there's the infrastructure you're performing the automation against. Ansible Automation supports hundreds of platforms, from Linux and Windows to VMware, to firewalls, routers, switches, load balancers, storage arrays, Internet of Things devices, wireless controllers, a bunch more. So let's talk about some of the ways you can use Ansible. Ad hoc commands are quick checks that you can run from your control node that you don't need to preserve within an Ansible playbook. These examples here assume the inventory that we saw earlier with the web and DB groups. The first example runs a check for connectivity with the target hosts by issuing the ping command. The second example runs the uptime command against the web group. The third example collects all the information it can against the local host running the setup command, outputting all those facts into the terminal, so into your command line. An inventory is a collection of hosts and managed nodes against which Ansible can run. After all, what's being managed if not the inventory? It's the reason you're using Ansible in the first place. Inventories consist of hosts, groups of hosts, inventory-specific data, so the groups or connection data info, and whether it's a static or dynamic source for the hosts. I'm using the term hosts because it's been expanded over time to include practically anything that's addressable on a network, like I mentioned before. We'll take a look at some of the inventory examples in a bit. The key point to remember is that playbooks are Ansible's configuration, deployment, and orchestration language. They can describe a policy that you want to enforce or a set of steps in your general IT processes. Ansible modules are the tools in your workshop, playbooks are your instruction manuals, and your target hosts are your raw material. Ansible playbooks can be used to manage your configurations for deployments to remote machines, at the basic level. At a more advanced level, you can provision things at scale, orchestrate multi-tier rollouts. You can even delegate actions to other hosts. I'm not going to say limitless, but the limits are pretty out there. Let's take a look at a playbook and let's see some of the pieces that we're talking about here. This is an example playbook that's simply installing Apache Server. It's small, but it gets the job done. Now, the name field is for your human-readable comments. They're optional, but they're really useful as a landmark within your playbooks. These strings show up in the output for both Ansible Engine and Ansible Tower, making it easy to correlate your failures to a specific task within a playbook. You'll be really glad you use them when your Ansible runs consist of multiple playbooks and roles, which we will get into. The hosts line in the beginning of the playbook should be pretty obvious. This is specifying which hosts the playbook is targeting. This is assuming that the inventory file that we saw earlier is being used in the example for this playbook. Variables can be handled in a few different ways. They can be handled within the playbook. They can be handled separately as part of a vars file. They can be inline via the command line command, as output from a previous play, or they can be managed specifically within Tower. That's one of the things that makes Tower so much more powerful than just using the Ansible engine and the terminal. You're not required to use root as a remote user, like we are in this example. You can have Ansible connect and run a playbook as any user or multiple users, as long as the user has permission to perform the task that the playbook is invoking. Excuse me. You can even use multiple users and specify different users for different plays of tasks within your playbook. The real work gets done here with the module name and the key equals value format. This example is pretty standard, doing the install, the configuration, and then start combination. Handlers are tasks, not really different from regular tasks, but they are referenced globally by a unique name. They're notified by calling them within a play. If nothing calls or notifies a handler, it won't run. Handlers don't run until all the other plays in a playbook have run, no matter how many times a handler is called by different plays within that playbook. It'll only run once at the end. In the example you see, it's got one of the easiest to understand examples for using a handler once the service is installed and configured and any other work that is completed. The service just needs to be started. You will probably find other reasons to use handlers in your specific environments. Variables are used to keep a layer of abstraction in your playbooks for reuse, refactoring, and so on. You would define your variables as needed in one or more host or group vars files within Tower, and so on. Variables can be practically any string you'd use, whether it's a file name, package version, host name, and so on. You want to be careful with wrapping them in quotes to avoid Python escape characters. The Ansible documentation will give you some points of reference for entering your argument or for entering your data in variables. Later, I'll cover precedence, but still keep that in mind. Some of these tips are going to be useful if you just started using Ansible. If you haven't tried Ansible yet, these tips are going to help you avoid pitfalls as you enter the larger world of automation. They're even good reminders for those of us who use Ansible regularly. Most importantly is to keep it simple. This is really important. What I mean by simplicity here is that Ansible works best when it's straightforward and repeatable without breaking anything on the target host. Simplicity doesn't mean just quick and dirty and fast in this case. That can only bring problems later on. Here's an example of what I mean by quick and dirty not being simple. This is what I would consider a terrible playbook, but not because it doesn't work. There's no naming for the plays or the playbook, which means the terminal or the Tower output when running this playbook would tell you next to nothing except that it ran and maybe confirm success or failure. Any person operating the control node or Tower interface would get very little useful feedback. Adding 3 lines to name the playbook and the plays not only gives this playbook something more useful to look at, it'll make the output when running the playbook descriptive and obvious. So this not only helps future editors for the playbooks, this helps the operators and people who are using your playbooks. Again, simplicity. It's all about being simple and straightforward and designed to be that way. While we're talking about simplicity and naming, it's worth showing how this applies to an inventory as well. Because of how networks work, a raw list of hosts is going to be little more than a list of network locations. Whether it's IP addresses or fully qualified names, an inventory list can get confusing the more entries that it has. Within your inventory file, your individual target hosts can be aliased to simpler names easily. Excuse me. These alias names are displayed in the terminal or tower output when the playbook is run, which makes identifying problems with playbooks easier. This is especially true when you aren't the original author of the playbook. Being able to correlate your host to the task where you're having a problem can make things very simple, very much easier. Static inventory works really well when you're managing a small environment that doesn't change very often, like a development environment or like my little home lab is, just a test environment. Dynamic inventories are crucial with large environments, especially those using your public, private, or hybrid cloud technology. Ansible ships with dynamic inventory scripts for most major cloud providers. It's also not difficult to write your own scripts or to pull data from a database or text files for your inventory. I'm going to warn beginners now. Most of your early problems are going to be syntax related. Writing playbooks more readable from the start will help you to avoid that and have more success as your playbooks grow and become more powerful. Again, we're dealing with a playbook that isn't wrong in the sense that it won't run, but the plays themselves are structured for minimalism and not really simplicity. Using the key equals value format in line with invoking the module has been a staple from some of the earliest versions of Ansible. Like I said, it works, but the more involved the plays get, the more likely this kind of format will start presenting, long scrolling horizontal lines per play, and it just won't be simple to read. So a quick reformat of this play that's invoking yum immediately makes things a little bit simpler to read for review. Note the greater than symbol after invoking yum. This is stacking the argument, which makes them easier to, which makes each item that's listed easier to parse for the reader. This method doesn't allow for highlighting in editors that use syntax highlighting, so use this type of stacking at your own risk. Instead, the native YAML format will have more lines, but those lines are going to be shorter. It reduces having to scroll horizontally or deal with long line wraps when editing your playbooks. This lets you scan straight down the play. For example, the task parameters are stacked and clear. The native YAML syntax has the benefit of syntax highlighting in most of your modern editors out there. So editors like Vim, Atom, VS Code, and so on will highlight YAML keys like your module names through directives and your parameter names from their values, giving you further aid in reading your content. And I'm only laughing because I know that I'm missing somebody's favorite editor out there. We all have our faves. Pico for life. Some of our own docs will use shorthand for legacy reasons, though. We're changing that as we come across it in our documentation, but documentation pull requests are accepted. Ansible does have a built-in syntax check. You can invoke it like you see on the screen. This check will go through and point out any errors it finds in the playbook that's called playbook.yaml. Ansible does also have a linter that's a little bit more robust than this. It's called separately from using Ansible Playbook. It has a similar tooling to syntax check, but it also lets you bake in rules to enforce your own style for playbooks within your organization. This is a good time to introduce roles. Roles are playbooks and their related materials in a named directory structure. This is meant to be portable and modular. I mean that roles are meant to be shared with your team. And really anyone who you feel is could make use of it. They help minimize the time spent writing your playbooks or rewriting your playbooks, especially for repeat activities. One of the policies that I've tried to go by with my home lab is anything I have to repeat more than twice, I try to come up with some sort of playbook for it. Some things to consider with roles. One thing per role. A group of roles where one role does one thing well will be more portable than one role that does multiple things, even if it does those things well. Be careful about inter-role dependencies. Roles are meant to be reused. So avoid the one role to rule them all method and instead consider them like tools in a toolbox. Playbooks and roles aren't programming, so try not to think about roles like classes or objects to be called within your program. Avoid your variable dependencies when transferring between roles as well. One small change can break your role or the plays you're trying to run. Portability is key. Remember that. Dependencies that aren't managed well can diminish that. And before going much further, I want to bring up variable precedence. Because those familiar with programming might know the term, but some of you might not. Variable precedence is the order in which the same variable from different sources will override each other. I mentioned using different sources earlier for variables. Ansible allows the use of variables from a total of 22 sources, each of which has their own level of precedence. Like I said, the latest Ansible has 22 levels of variable precedence, where the variable higher in precedence, in the case of this list, the closest to 1, will overwrite any variable of the same name with a lower precedence. In the example you see here, this means extra vars will always take precedence over the others, and command line values will always be overwritten. What this means is if you invoke a playbook and pass the variables along, in line with the command, anything that's within the playbook that uses the same variable name will overwrite whatever you used in the command line command. Don't worry, Ansible documentation gives you this list of precedents for reference. You don't have to be screenshotting this or copying this list right now as I'm speaking. Some last considerations and some things to avoid. Ansible has modules for most of your environment's needs. Just in case, Ansible includes run command modules as well. Please try to treat these modules, like the shell and command module, as your last resort. I say this because the command module is basically like having Ansible run a command in terminal on target host. This is a useful command when there's no module that meets the need, but it can be problematic. For example, the command module will treat redirect characters like pipes as an escape instead of like a pipe that you would have normally within the command line. And that could break your playbook, or worse, provide some security considerations. The shell module is really made for network devices and should only be used for I/O redirect. So as I briefly showed you before, compared to everything else in the Ansible Automation Platform, Ansible Content Collections is kind of new. Collections are the distribution format for Ansible content, and it's meant to increase the flexibility and improve the scalability of Ansible for your organization. What I mean is that Ansible has grown a lot over the years, and the number of modules that ship with Ansible has grown even faster. For our partners that create some of these modules, the Ansible release schedule can become a bottleneck when it comes to adding new features or new modules. Other partners are interested in providing template roles and plugins along with their module content. Ansible Content Collections, or as I call them, collections, provide that flexibility to our partners while keeping Ansible's own development cycle. In practical terms for you, the individual organization interested in using the platform, it means more up-to-date modules and other content, and you don't have to wait for the next Ansible release. For those interested also, Collections as a framework allows you to build your own content collection tailored for your organization's preferences. You can browse, install, and use Collections through Ansible Galaxy or Ansible Automation Hub as well. Excuse me. This is how the inside of a collection is laid out. Much like roles, collections use a set directory structure that you can initialize using the Ansible Galaxy command to either initialize or download the collection. There are collections that contain only modules. There are collections that contain only roles. There are collections that have both, as well as plugins and so on. Each of these can be separately maintained and updated by the owners of the collection. That's the point and the beauty of it. Here's a quick list of commands to interact with collections. Again, you don't have to copy these. We're including initializing a collection. In this case, we're initializing a collection named bar under the namespace foo. We also have a few examples here of using Ansible test, which I mentioned earlier, against a collection using your sanity, your unit testing, and your integration testing. You also have packaging the collection using the build command. You have publishing the collection to Galaxy. We also have at the bottom installing the collection using its name on Galaxy or Automation Hub. Like I said, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a list of links to our documentation. So no need to copy all these commands. We're happy to get this stuff to you. We've been working on it for a while, and we want to have this stuff. We love having this in your hands. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope this information was helpful. We'll be sending up the follow-up information after we're finished, like I said. In the meantime, we have a few minutes for some Q&A. And this is, in no particular order, everything that I was speaking about and more. So let's look at some of the questions and answers. I use VS Code. So we've got Ranish. I use VS Code for writing playbooks. I like it so far. Me too. I like it as well. If a machine is part of two groups in the host file, and the same variable is in both group vars, group.yaml files for that machine, which one takes precedence? Well, hopefully the list that I showed you earlier, displaying the precedence. Let's see if I can scroll back to it real quick. There we are. That should help you answer your question about which one is going to take precedence. As far as being in two groups, the only thing that will do is when you invoke the group, the target host will also be included both times. Do we have any other unanswered questions? Not looking like I'm seeing much. What VS Code extension am I using for Ansible development? I don't know the name of it offhand. However, I can open it up and take a look real quick. But my guess is if you do a search for Ansible, you will likely find the plugin that you're looking for. I cannot find the plugin right now. So, but like I said, in VS Code, when you're doing the search for the plugins, check for Ansible. It's going to be listed in there. Use the one that has a lot more comments on it. The quick question about can Ansible be used for network devices? Can we create playbooks for that also? The answer is definitely yes. Ansible is used against lots of your network devices. There are lots of modules that are included for devices from Cisco, F5, Dell, Hitachi. I'm missing a whole bunch, but we've got a lot. So if it's network addressable, it could probably be interacted with using Ansible. If I ever used WSL2, I have not. And to answer for JetBrains, I don't know what extension is the best. However, there are probably some folks who are using the same IDE as you and will probably have suggestions. Are there instructions for setting up a home lab? That's a little outside my scope. If you want to find some suggestions for a good home lab using some cheap equipment, we've had some folks that we've worked with before. Jeff Geerling has some guides on that. Outside of that, I can't really give you any official advice. Simple getting started template that we can use to learn Ansible. Check the documentation. We have some examples in there. Jack Chen, you will get a video of this entire presentation in follow-up. And got a question about Ansible security. How secure is it to use Ansible for high security setup? That's going to depend on how you set up and use. We do have some best practices for security. However, that's getting a little bit outside of the scope for what we're talking about here. Are the key value parameters predefined or could be used? No, you cannot use any key value for your Ansible tasks. That's why I mentioned the documentation earlier. And inside the list of links that are here, you can find, let's see, which one is. It's not listed here. I'm sorry, I was mistaken. But do a search for the index on the modules, and you'll get documentation on each of them. Looks like someone shared a VS Code plugin. So thank you for that. Ansible does indeed support remote execution on your control node architectures. So if I understand you correctly, yes. Another question about learning the syntax and structure for Ansible playbooks. If you take a look at the screen, the third link down for the user guide has a playbooks introduction. That's really going to give you the basics for building your first playbooks and how to run them. I really suggest, and we will be sending this out in a follow-up email, keeping hold of these links because they're going to hold a lot more information than I can share in this one webinar. Jeff Zhu, I cannot give you specific advice simply because that's a little out of the scope of what we're covering here today. I saw another comment from Ranish. Yes, you can using Docker. You can set up an Ansible lab environment. You can also, I have for years been using the tool called Vagrant, which works along with your with a virtualization engine. But yes, Docker is another way to go. You can absolutely use that to build your own little Ansible lab. Ed Nicholson asks if the workflow for Tower and AWX are similar. That is affirmative. AWX is upstream, so it's going to be a little bit more new and bleeding edge. Tower is the more stable of the two. So it may sometimes look a little different. However, the workflow is going to be the same. They're built from the same materials. How to interpret the output of a playbook with multiple tasks. To really get a good summary of what that looks like, again, I would point you to the playbooks intro, where it walks you through creating a playbook and running a playbook. And as you run the playbook in your command line, you will see in a pretty straightforward and readable manner how each of the tasks that are listed inside of your playbook will show up as output in your terminal. What's my recommendation if I want to reuse tasks from other playbooks? My recommendation is make sure the tasks are built for portability, meaning, like I said earlier, keeping them simple, not using a lot of dependencies, and structuring them in a way that they're as standalone as possible and can be rerun without causing damage. The question about any tutorials for beginners learning YAML, again, I want to point you to the third link down, the intro to playbooks. That will walk you through the beginnings. Can Ansible output be scraped by Prometheus? I don't know the actual answer to that. If you're talking about scraping web content through the API, then possibly. But if that's something that's a little more involved, that I would need to do more looking in on. Like the questions are slowing down a little bit. what is a redfish module? You'll have to take a look in the module index to get a better idea. Don Harris. I wish I could give you the slide deck right now. We will send you the links in the email that's going to be following this broadcast. When should you write a module and when should it be a filter? A module is going to be when you're going to execute things. A filter is going to filter what Ansible is looking at. Yes, there are some playbooks in the documentation and on GitHub. There are definitely some materials present that you can use to learn and acquaint yourself a little bit more with Ansible. I highly recommend checking out ansible.github.io/workshops. That has got a lot of learning materials that you can interact with immediately today to start building up your skills with Ansible and get yourself familiarized. Set up an Ansible task to automate reconnecting to a server. What happens with Ansible is that it connects to run the task at hand, and then it disconnects. It doesn't maintain a connection. If you're doing something like that, you're going to probably want to invoke a specific connection like an SSH using that module rather than having Ansible maintain that connection for you. Okay, this is looking like getting most of the questions out of the way. If there's nothing else, oh wait, looks like there might be a couple more. Again, I don't know a specific JetBrains plugin. You're going to have to look for that. I really don't. I don't use that. Like I said, we all have our different ones. I mainly use Atom if I'm in a command line, or I use Vim if I'm in the terminal. Got another question. Is there a recommended practice for preference for the content format? Modules, roles, collections. So looks like that was actually answered. Right. So like Jake answered, your modules are your executable content. Your roles are going to hold playbooks and sometimes configuration files or templates. And your collections are going to hold all of these things, including your plugins and your filters. So it's really a matter of what are you trying to build? Are you just trying to build an executable piece of code that you're going to run against something that's going to operate inside of Ansible? Are you using a set of playbooks, or are you using a lot of distributed content that you need to hold in one content collection? That'll give you the answer for when to use the different formats. The ansible.github.io reference I made is, again, ansible.github.io/workshops. On your screens, you should see it's the fourth URL up. You should be able to just copy that last trailing slash Ansible, and that'll give you the root page for that content. Oh gosh, I don't know. I couldn't list all of the Atom plugins that I'm using. The OpenShift Ansible integration guide is going to be again a little bit outside of my scope. However, you can probably find more information on that on the documentation. I cannot do a tower installation demo. That would take a little too long. And resources for help standing up tower, I would suggest starting with AWX. AWX will give you the same experience. Like I said, it's upstream, so it's going to be more bleeding edge. However, it's going to give you your best simple and straightforward experience with the tower platform. Thank you, Mustafa. I did know that Red Hat Learning does have labs for Ansible as well. That is true. If you are a subscriber to Red Hat Learning, there are lots of Ansible resources in place, including for Tower. Would I install Ansible AWX into a container to use as a lab? If I recall correctly, Ansible AWX already is installable as a container. So yes. Oh, quick question. Can I explain the difference between engine and tower? So I did. Engine is the product that's built off of the Ansible project. The Ansible project is that command line that system that you use that when you yum install or install from the various locations. Tower is using a RESTful API, a web-based interface, and tons of enterprise features, specifically for things like RBAC and management of different groups of users that are going to be operating on in your Ansible environment. So really, what Tower is it's the GUI enterprise version of Ansible Engine. Rocco and Derek Arnold. Derek shared the Docker to the AWX container. All right. If you're looking for lab information, I would definitely suggest checking the workshops, and also the Red Hat Learning resources should be providing you with a lab when you log into them. Leo, yeah, the to get into the weeds for the RBAC stuff, um, that would definitely be, there should be some documentation on refining your permissions. The latest version of Ansible, latest version I believe is, don't actually know. I'm going to check. So we're at 2.11. To get you a better number. I'm sorry. So the Ansible version is at 2.10.5. But I think the lowest version of Python we support is 2.7. Thanks, Anshul. Alrighty. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. I want to thank everybody for showing up. Again, we're going to get you the email with the stuff, with all of the resources that I've talked about and all of the links that I've shared out as soon as possible, as well as a recording of this this webinar. Thanks everybody for coming. Glad that you stuck it out with me. And I know, again, I wanted to notice that I saw that we had people from all over the place here. And we were talking just before I went on about the amazing dedication to automation. Thanks again, everybody, for showing up.